So good morning and welcome. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank the press, obviously, for the coverage that we've gotten over the past several days, and I want to also say that I'm very pleased it was very fair and accurate. I'm not in the habit of thanking reporters necessarily for reporting the news, but I do want to do a shout out to Paul Hughes of the Rep-Am newspaper, just because he's been following this story for 10 years since the beginning. And he followed it faithfully. In fact, he contacted me sometimes before I even knew what was going on with the court. And so I just wanted to thank him very briefly. On the other hand, there was one bad headline, and that was the AP. And not only is the headline wrong, it misses the point entirely. And their headline read, "Bashing governor in publicly funded campaign ads is okay in Connecticut legislative races. Court rules." And of course, as I said, that misses the point entirely. We're here this morning, partly because we did answer a lot of questions. The press did reach out to us. There's been a lot of coverage, but we've never gotten really the opportunity to share, our view and our story, and that's why we're here today. I'm going to let Senator Markley do a lot of the filling in of that, but I do want to make a couple of points very briefly. One of them is that this is never about us. We, for better or worse, jumped in front of a moving train, but we did it on our own. It's been reported, I don't know if the number's accurate, but I've seen it reported that there were 27 campaigns that were hit with the same complaint. And all of us, those 27 campaigns, including Joe and I, were offered the opportunity to simply sign a document saying, we did wrong, we're never going to do it again, to avoid a fine. And those other 25 candidates made the decision to do so. I don't begrudge them for doing that. But Joe and I looked at it and said, somebody has to stand here for the principle of free political speech, and that's why we chose to do so. I spoke to someone yesterday, actually, who mentioned to me that their treasurer actually had to sign a document saying that they could never be a treasurer in a political campaign again. And to me, that is kind of one of the reasons why this is so important. So we said no. And we said no on the principle of what we believed necessary to protect political speech in the state of Connecticut. And that's the obvious part. But the other part of this is that we are standing up to what I think is a clear abuse of power and influence. Ever since that election cycle, campaigns and candidates in both parties, but particularly Republicans, have been limited in their speech. And it's an important question that has never really been delved into to ask how and why. What prompted that advisory opinion just 2 weeks before Election Day back in 2014? And why and how did 27 separate Democratic legislative candidates know to file complaints on this topic? This, to me, is a glaring example of the danger of big government and the bureaucratic state. And that is what I was protesting all this time, the ability of the bureaucratic state to influence elections by regulating political speech. It's in part by restricting political speech in the way the case addresses, but also in my case in particular, having this fine and charge hanging over me for the last several election cycles where my political opponents use as an opportunity to campaign against me. Imagine the irony of me not being able to hold the governor and the Democrats responsible for their political agenda that my colleagues in the legislature voted for and supported against them in a political campaign, but the ability for my opponents to use what we know now was a false charge and fine against me. So yes, I feel vindicated, and I'm excited to be able to stand before you knowing that the justice was served and freedom of speech is protected in the state of Connecticut. And I'm very, very thrilled to play a part in that. And I guess I'll turn it over to Joe, but I want to just briefly thank the many people that helped us throughout the process, particularly the Institute for Free Speech. We had many wonderful attorneys over the course of 10 years. Some of them didn't remain the whole time, but they all contributed in some way, particularly Charles Miller, who was our attorney at the end, and our friend Mario, who is with us today, and also our colleague, Representative Doug Dubitsky, who contributed as well. And I'll turn it over to Joe.
What do you think? I shouldn't have touched it.
You're good. I know. I'll raise it up a little bit for you.
Thank you.
That should be. Ooh, that should be good.
Height is a curse, Joe.
That should be good.
Everything is a curse. Rob, thank you very much. A pleasure to be with you, and a pleasure to be with you under these victorious circumstances. And, you know, as much as anything, I just want to make 2 points about things that have bugged me over the last 7 years. Rob kind of laid out some of the principles of the case. The first thing I'll say is, Michael Brandy, the executive director of the SEEC, in response to this case, was quoted as saying, well, it's a notoriously tricky application of the law. And I think, you know, now, 10 years after you went after us, with the full force of the lawyers of the State Elections Enforcement Commission and the Attorney General's office trying to nail us on this, you say, oh, well, it was kind of tricky. That was sort of our point all along. And, but what I found with the SEC was, as long as there was a willingness to negotiate with them, they were as friendly as could be. But as soon as they knew we were going to stand up to them, they couldn't have been more nasty. And I don't complain about that much in politics. You're used to some sharp elbows in politics. Nonetheless, I feel like most political debate, especially between politicians, is respectful. I served 8 years in the Senate with Martin Looney. We couldn't disagree more. There's nobody on a personal level I had more respect for. And that's true of a lot of these people. But boy, the bureaucrats at the State Elections Enforcement Commission could not have been more nasty. When they had us in for their hearing in 2017, they went up one side of us and down the other. It wasn't a matter of saying, let's try to figure out where we stand on this notoriously tricky application of the law. It's, you are a criminal, and not just me and not just Rob, but my treasurer, Barb Roberts, as sweet and innocent a woman as you could imagine, ended up in tears in the hallway after the questioning that she got from Attorney William Smith, who in my opinion was a great, to use a good Shakespearean term, a grade A ass. So I think that the members, the actual members, not the staff of the State Elections Enforcement Commission, ought to take a look at how their attorneys handled this matter, especially given that they were slapped down 5-0 on an issue that that all these lawyers disagreed with a couple with an English major and whatever the hell Rob is. But our interpretation of the law was right, theirs was wrong. They should have a little humility. And the second thing I'll say is they constantly came back at us, and the press covered this too frequently, saying, well, when you accepted the public money, you agreed to abide by the rules. Here's the form I signed, and it said, I certify, I understand I'm required to comply with the requirements of the program, including all Connecticut statutes, regulations, and declaratory rulings. There is nothing in there about what was called an advisory opinion issued less than 3 weeks before an election. As I said at the hearing, nothing in my mind could be weaker than an advisory opinion. They had their opinion, I had my opinion. At that point, it had to be adjudicated, and it took us 7 years, well 10 years, starting from when it happened, for that adjudication to take place. Hey, one person and one group I'll give props to is the Connecticut State Supreme Court, which are no political allies of ours. I don't know how many of them I voted against, but certainly some of them. But I thought they rendered a fair decision based on the evidence. And in their opinion, clear evidence. They said, I have it here, we conclude that none of the communications at issue in this appeal could reasonably be construed as anything more than a rhetorical device intended to communicate the merits of the plaintiff's candidacies. So I will say that by implication, that means the interpretation offered by Michael Brandy and Mr. Smith and the State Elections Enforcement Commission was certainly unreasonable. So thank you very much. And Mario, do you want to add something?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Justice Robinson announced his retirement recently, and I'm so glad that he's going out. One of his last opinions is this opinion that is so defensive of the freedom of speech. I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful for these gentlemen for having stood up for the freedom of speech. All too often, it's too costly politically to stand up for free speech. They talked about others who could not come forward, who did not come forward. We don't blame them, but nonetheless, there was a cost, there was a risk, and these gentlemen stood up for free speech, and they helped defend that core value of political speech, the freedom to speak about your opponents in a political race. It's so important to American values of the freedom of speech. That's all I have to say.
questions?
Any questions?
I'm never going to say no to asking you some questions, Rob. So we're in an election cycle right now. As you've mentioned, it's been 10 years since this situation all started. Now it's coming to a conclusion. In your opinion, what could these effects be for this year's election cycle in 2024?
Well, I think that, as I mentioned in my remarks, I think that, political speech has been stifled ever since the original case began, because candidates were fearful of, stepping over the line that was drawn that we were debating. So that's going to change things in a big way. I don't know that it's going to make campaigns any nicer or friendlier. In fact, they might even be more vitriolic, but they will be more free. And that's the important part, is that people that are engaging in political speech shouldn't have to fear that some bureaucracy is going to come along and tell them what they can and cannot do. And for me, that's the danger of this whole thing. I understand the desire to have some sort of rules and regulations to govern how campaigns are run and financed. That makes sense. But when that system grows to a point where they're actually affecting the ability of candidates to be able to choose what their speech is, then they've crossed the line. And I'm very pleased that we have, I think, made a bright line, and I think where it belongs.
Oh, yeah.
I'll say in 2014, Dan Malloy was unpopular, and Democrats were concerned that Republicans would tie their Democratic opponents to Dan Malloy. In 2024, Donald Trump in Connecticut is pretty unpopular, and I think now Democrats will try to tie their Republican opponents to Donald Trump. The question isn't who it benefits, the question is what's fair, what's constitutional. Sometimes it's going to help one side, sometimes it's going to help the other side. That's a sign that it's a fair thing.
And, some might say, well, you could have just, paid the couple $1,000 fine, moved on. Why'd you keep at it for a whole 10 years?
Right, well, we didn't even have to do that. I mean, when they originally came to us, all we had to do was sign a document saying that we were admitting guilt and that we wouldn't do it again, and there would have been no fine at all. So we took this on because of the political point, or not the political point, the constitutional point that needed to be made.
I just want to say, it's those little signatures, those little offers, that's so often where the freedom of speech dies, are in those little offers. And I'm so grateful to these gentlemen for standing up, notwithstanding that.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming out. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yay!